Welcome back, colleagues. I'm glad you could join us for this segment on private equity. We have another real good question as far as what is negotiable when you get a private equity offer?
Yeah, great, Dr. Carmen, and good to see you again. Thank you for moderating our panel this morning. Yeah, this is a question that we touched on just briefly in our video series number 3 when talking about really what private equity is and what EBIT is and all those kind of, and why representation. One of the big values of representation is knowing what is negotiable and what isn't. Because to be really frank, there are some things that just are not negotiable. If you take some of your large private equity groups who now have anywhere from 300, 350 to, maybe a group like my eye doctor that has 750 practices. So it's not their first rodeo, as we say out here in the Midwest. They own 750 practices. And so there are some things in the transaction that just simply are not going to be negotiable. And I think, as I mentioned in the why representation section video, that I used an example of a client we worked with that on the first go around attempted to negotiate his own deal, which was fine, and that everybody can certainly do that. But because he really wasn't versed in the intricacies of private equity, he was picking hills to die on and things to negotiate that just simply weren't going to be negotiable. But are there things? Yes, there's a myriad of things that are negotiable. Obviously, one of the big ones is price. Part of negotiation, part of good negotiation, I think, is it takes a certain amount of self-awareness in order to negotiate well. And obviously, you always want to be in a position of strength when you negotiate. And sometimes clients don't always understand what their strength is, whether that's their personal strength, whether that's the practice financial strength and capability. Perhaps they're in a region of the country that's not really all that desirable. So getting a private equity firm to perhaps entertain a purchase is something that maybe might be the most important part of the negotiations, is to sell the value of a particular practice. It may be a wonderful, great practice, but it might be, in terms of many of the private equity firms and their strategic platform, it may well be an outlier. It just may be a practice that's in a part of the country that they're not in, or they're not excited to be in. Obviously, purchase price is, and knowing what probably the intrinsic value of the practice is, so that we can negotiate the best purchase price. Sometimes the payment terms have to be negotiated. We really saw a lot of that during the height of COVID. In March of 2020, I think we really earned our money when COVID hit, because obviously when COVID hit, no one knew what the impact of anywhere from 60 to 120 days of closure would look like on a lot of optometric practices. And so in fairness to private equity, they made their offers to many of our clients based on a pre-COVID full 12-month normal business operation. And then, of course, in March, it was around the first week of March of 2020 when COVID hit, and basically the governments mandated, both federal and state governments mandated the closure of all non-essential services. And so fortunately, optometry was able to become, was considered an essential service, but most practices were working on very limited schedules. Many for at least 60 to 90 days. We're seeing only emergencies, doing a lot of telemedicine. And so one of the things that happened is when we reopened again back in May of 2020, many of the private equities had to come back with a modified letter of intent to account for and take into account what happened with the impact of COVID. And so I think we were very helpful in knowing what to negotiate. For example, most optometrists, in most peer-to-peer transactions, there's not much in the area of holdbacks and earnouts. And so generally in 9 out of 10 peer-to-peer transactions, if you and I, Dr. Carmen, agreed I'll buy your practice for $500,000, and we have a closing date of December 31st of this year, you're expecting and anticipating that on the closing date, you're going to get $500,000.
Absolutely.
But in private equity, and this cuts across things other than healthcare, because I've been involved in a couple transactions with friends that have been in private equity, and all private equity firms, all big buyers of businesses, always have some holdbacks for representations and warranties and unknown liabilities that could surface after I buy the business. And so even though we've agreed on a purchase price, some of the things that have to be negotiated is how much that holdback is, when am I going to receive that holdback, obviously the purchase price. And another big area an area of negotiation is your employment contract. Those can kind of vary. There's some give and take in the employment contract in terms of how I'll be paid, what will be paid for me. A very important element, depending on the situation. Some doctors don't want to work. They'd rather work a less amount of time than a longer amount of time if possible. I think we've been very helpful to our clients in trying to get that expectation met. And sometimes a client is willing to work for a little less money if they can get out in 2 or 3 years instead of the customary 4 or 5 years. And so there's a myriad of other things, the covenant not to compete. There's a myriad of things that go into, the things to be negotiated. And quite frankly, there are some things that are difficult to negotiate. The reps and warranty is just a thing that concept will be in every deal, but what's negotiable is what the terms and conditions of those reps and warranties look like. The real estate can be another area of, if you own your own building. One of the great things, and kind of sometimes a thing that I don't think is emphasized enough, doesn't apply if you don't own your building, but if you own your own real estate and the practice is in seller occupied real estate, then you're going to have a really nice long-term 10-year tenant in your building. And so negotiating part of the lease for the space is also another critical and important thing.
Very good. Yeah, there are a lot of different things that can be negotiated. So that wraps up this session, and we've got one more for you guys. So